let's go ahead and get started. So, we've had a lot of conversations today about the major milestones we're seeing across the industry, and a lot of that has to do with, I mean, it's all due to the people that are driving that capability. So my name is Justice Killian. I'm a partner here at Space Capital. In addition to investing, I lead our space talent platform. If you're not familiar with it, it's a free tool that we provide to support an audience of over 50,000 to help find careers at the intersection of space and tech. With a lot of the layoffs that are happening right now, it's actually an invaluable tool to help sort of smooth that transition and bring really great talent into this domain. And so we're spending a lot of time working on it. And so excited to dig in today. Aaron Zeeb, he's an operating partner at Space Capital. He'll be joining us for the conversation. He works with us both pre and post investment, focusing on talent. Aaron has 25 years experience recruiting. Early in his career, he joined Google shortly after their IPO when the company was going through hyper growth. He was recruited away from Google to join a little sort of unknown company at the time, SpaceX. He spent 6 years there working closely with Elon and the team to grow from 300 to 4,300. It's saw some really incredible transformation, not only in the company, but the industry at the time. Now he's a partner at Sapphire Partners, focusing on executive search and specializing in hard tech. Aaron's an invaluable member of the team, and we're super excited. I'm super excited to chat with him today. Anything I missed there, Aaron? Is that all right?
No, I think that's a great intro. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to give us a little bit of context to set the stage. So space is the domain of big visions, monumental engineering feats, and incredible talent that's working to achieve both of those realities. As a thesis-driven investor, we look to history to shed light on the future of where investment opportunities will emerge. There really is, for our story, there is no better place to start than the Apollo program. It spanned from 1961 to 1975, had one of humanity's most ambitious goals to set foot on the surface of the moon and return safely. This bold vision and significant investment inspired and attracted incredible talent. The program cost roughly $150 billion in 2022 adjustment as of today. It employed 400,000 people directly. We actually ended up seeing it seed massive economic development across the United States and sort of across the value chain. We saw a development in specialized manufacturing, the use of computing to solve new complex problems, advancements in construction. It drove innovations in logistics, transportation, and even how we prepare our food. We saw large corporations, including Boeing and GE, develop divisions focused specifically on space. That's true to even this day. I think one of the most important things that we saw that came out of that era was it shaped a generation of leaders that had experience in high-stake environments, cutting-edge technology, interdisciplinary expertise, and a risk-taking culture that were foundational in sort of leading innovation and making that big vision possible. That culture also laid the foundation for entrepreneurs. And we saw this in two specific examples that I think are relevant to us today. Pete Conrad, he commanded the Apollo 12 mission. He was the third person to walk on the moon. And T.K. Mattingly, who flew on Apollo 16 and commanded the early space shuttle test flights. Both of these guys went on after they retired to focus on the commercial space. And they worked together at Universal Space Networks alongside my partner, Tom Ingersoll, and became one of the first successful private space companies and actually helped change the way that government contracted with the private sector that laid the foundation for us today. But at some point in that era, from Apollo to, let's call it the dot-com boom, the space sector sort of lost its appeal, and talent sought different sort of educational paths and career fields, to the point where we were seeing a shortage of engineers and just a real lack of interest. And so that's where we're going to spend our time and our conversation today. Space is once again attracting some of the best and brightest. This time, it's a culture of risk-taking and innovation being driven by entrepreneurs, not the government. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, I mean, the most well-recognized entrepreneurs of our time, they've all said that the Apollo missions had a significant impact on their lives, and they've each gone on to found some of the largest space companies today. For entrepreneurship to flourish, capital is required. Like we saw in the Apollo era, space requires money. We've seen equity investment go from a trickle in the early 2000s to a steady stream of around to 1,900 space companies being backed and nearly 290 billion in equity financing over the past 20 years. One company's paved the way more than all others, and that's SpaceX. SpaceX has raised $9 billion in equity and roughly a similar amount from the government through support through various contracting methods. And here's what they've been able to achieve. They're the first private company to develop a liquid propellant rocket that reached orbit. First private company to launch, orbit, and recover a spacecraft, to send a spacecraft to the International Space Station, to send astronauts to orbit, and to the International Space Station. The company has now achieved 227 launches, 188 landings, 162 reflights, and they've expanded into satellite communications that have launched more than 4,100 satellites, and they now operate the largest constellation ever built. This is incredible achievement that's being driven by this company. And so with that context, I want to focus the conversation with you, Aaron, on can you help us understand how SpaceX reignited interest in space, overcame really some huge odds to be a private company to be able to achieve this where only governments had been able to do so in the past, and ultimately what it means for the future. So maybe a good starting point is, Aaron, you left Google to join SpaceX in 2008. I mean, what a shift. That's, it wasn't SpaceX at the time. So what was the company like when you first joined, and what convinced you to leave Google and join SpaceX?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you did a good job of kind of setting the stage. It's really important to capture the moment in time. In 2008 when I joined, I've seen different numbers, 300, 500, but my recollection was closer to 300 people. But at that point, Elon was the guy that got fired from PayPal. He was the guy that started a electric vehicle company that was failing and a rocket company that was on the precipice of failing. So he was not known as the individual that he was known for, or is known for, being now, and some of the successes that he's led to, over the last 10, 20 years. But the problem within the industry was, as you said, nobody was really paying attention to aerospace. What SpaceX did was really kind of create a new paradigm. For the first time, and it took a long time to build this message, is how we're different, why we're different, where we're different. And a lot of that was fed by the culture. When Elon was starting the company, and he'll say this today, everything he does is based around first principles. So, he looked at the material costs of a launch vehicle and said, it's like 2% of the total costs of launch back then. Why is it so expensive? Started from there. But you look at rapid reusability, he didn't benchmark against what anyone else was doing because no one else was doing reusable rockets, but he benchmarked against, the airline industry. If you could land an airplane and, refuel, restock the, sodas and peanuts and turn around and fly in, an hour's time, then, you should be able to do that same thing with with the launch vehicle industry. So yeah, the interesting part when I came in was, and the charter for me was, we've lost the best engineers. They're no longer looking at aerospace, and we need to bring them back. So coming from Google, it was really about, how do we get people that have traditionally, back in 2008, they had been going to Twitter, ironically, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, some of these other more software predominant companies. So, how do we really bring that talent back? And that was the part that we were trying to, crack the code on. But a lot of that, the core values that they instilled, the changes in the paradigm was, this focus on first principles, this focus on, merit-based hiring. And most importantly, and that's really the point of going after, the best talent in the industry. That's what Elon wanted to do, was return that talent base back to aerospace. And that's what they've done over the last 20 years.
So opening up the aperture and seeing, bringing in people that can, shed light from multiple perspectives is really important. You and I have talked a lot about, the culture that was required to sort of enable that talent to do, and flourish in a really tense and intense environment. So, what is it? Can we unpack what you observed as the most important sort of cultural aspects within SpaceX over your period and sort of, to date that have separated it and allowed it to achieve, what's, the milestones today?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned the focus on first principles. That's where it kind of started. It's also, it was a factor of where we were at in the marketplace at that time. We were a small shop trying to go up against these massive companies in a space that, everyone thought we would fail. So, the culture became, one of execution and speed. It really, it mattered if we, didn't move fast because we didn't have the same amount of capital. We had to keep our team small. But that also became an important element of our success. When I started there, we had brought in a lot of talent from aerospace that, traditional aerospace at that time was just used to a different pace. Tom had talked earlier about, the James Webb Space Telescope and, some of the timeline of that project. These were entire, career-long projects. We had to do things in, the matter of months and years. Excuse me. So it was really about, speed and execution. But by keeping the team small, the phrase that Elon, really coined at that time is, SpaceX is the special forces. We do the missions that people think are impossible. We keep our teams small, we keep our teams focused, and we also have high levels of ownership. One of the major things that Elon did was eliminate systems engineers, the people that kind of look at the broader architecture of projects. Elon felt like, the responsible engineers should know exactly and talk to the other responsible engineers to understand how the design was done. So there was very close integration with the teams, very high level of ownership, but also a very clear charter coming from the top. And that's Elon about, what our mission is, what the expectation is from a timeline, from an architecture standpoint. So all of that kind of bled into the culture. At that time, we became incredibly vertically integrated because the ecosystem wasn't set up to support, where we were buying hardware from. The supply chain in aerospace was just, it was pretty poor and it was super expensive. The timelines were terrible, the capabilities were terrible. So we had to, take all these and build all these capabilities in-house. But, again, the most important thing, and I think that the most interesting thing that you're seeing in the industry right now is, he made a concerted effort in 2008 to say, we've got to go after, the best engineers, and the best engineers have gone to the most interesting companies working on the most interesting problems. So, for instance, if you're trying to build communication systems, even though it's, and this is back in 2010 time period, even though, it's satellite systems, you need to go towards the mobile industry because that's where the best people have been. So shop where the talent is, get them interested in space, tell them what we're doing and why we're doing is different. Now, fortunately over the years now and the success that Elon and SpaceX have had, they've built the inertia. I think now engineers are looking at space, as a first choice of path. SpaceX was recently named again the top, place for engineers coming out of college to work at. So it's been an interesting shift how that whole process is set up. Literally, when I was there, I couldn't get people to, pay attention to what we were doing. Nobody really understood it. Frankly, I didn't understand how we were different when I first interviewed at SpaceX. But now that entire shift is it's transformed the entire industry.
Yeah, I mean, what a fundamental shift. And I think the incentives were really important as well from the early days. From a sales and product standpoint, the company said, we're going to be transparent on our pricing and our launch costs. And it forced everybody to deliver. I mean, it couldn't be a cost plus contract where you're continually have a moving target. And the teams, were incentivized then to deliver against that. And they had equity stake, in the performance of the company. And so you start to see these really nice aligned incentives that, not only get people working on incredible opportunities, but, they see the value of what they're creating. So we've seen a major cultural shift, not only within the company, but also within the industry. It seems like SpaceX is at a new inflection point. The company's grown to nearly 10,000 people. It's taking on its most ambitious projects to date. Can you help us understand how SpaceX can continue to maintain this culture of innovation, while it's executing at scale?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm no longer there, but I think you can see this from the outside. The culture that was set originally, it still remains true today. But most importantly, and this is the thing, part of the reason I moved to this side of the desk, coming from Google, coming from SpaceX, was to understand, why are some companies successful, particularly at an early stage versus some other companies that fail. And I think you look at the culture of execution at SpaceX, having a clear vision, having a focus on small teams, high levels of execution, having a merit-based environment where titles are less important, the best ideas can come from anywhere. These are the things that are most important to the success of any company. And to maintain that as a company scales is the most difficult thing. Oftentimes, you install processes, and processes they tend not to go away over time. So Elon's done really interesting things, and any process at SpaceX is named after the person that implemented it. That way, if it's an Aaron Zeeb process, and it's now I left there in 2014. And people no longer know who I am, they're going to ask why that process exists. So, removing as much process as you're installing, but also, just high levels of ownership, maintaining that culture. Obviously the employees have done exceptionally well from an equity standpoint, but the career currency you get going into an environment like that, where there's just such high levels of ownership, where if you execute, you'll be recognized, you'll move up the food chain pretty quickly, and get more ownership and get more scope. Sometimes flying too close to the sun can be a little risky, particularly in an environment that's, tends to be a little cutthroat like SpaceX. But, the things that I'm seeing is really these engineers that are leaving that program, going out to start other companies. They've gotten, the best education, they've gotten a PhD in what it means to build a startup and grow a startup. And yeah, I think that's one of the key factors that I'm seeing. But to get back to the root of your question, I think it really gets down to like having a clear vision. At SpaceX, it was always the plan is to go to Mars, but how do we put incremental steps to get there? Falcon 1 originally was Falcon 5. We retired and sunsetted that plan and went straight to Falcon 9. Then Dragon, getting into human rated, understanding how to fly people into space became incredibly important. The industry aligned with a lot of what we were doing. Sunsetting the shuttle program, which really wasn't sustainable. Moving towards commercial crew projects, government funding. These things have paid off in a massive way. For SpaceX and for the industry and for humanity as a whole.
You touched on a really important point there. So as the space economy is maturing on the back of SpaceX, and the markets are starting to jitter, we're seeing two trends that are driving a redistribution of this talent. So the first is growth in new business opportunities, both up and downstream from launch. You've heard us say it multiple times, but I'll say it again. We've seen about a 300% increase over the last 3 years from founders coming out of space companies. And these founders are launching businesses in over 40 different industries. So on that growth side, Aaron, you sort of talked about this PhD and successful execution. Is there anything else around that that's sort of driving those new founders?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think, you work in an environment like SpaceX, and this is, that spirit has spread across the industry. Not only are, former SpaceX and Tesla and, other rocket companies and satellite companies going after, rather going out and starting their own companies, but they're also joining these other companies that are trying to build, rockets from scratch. So they're taking that, knowledge and spreading it across the ecosystem. Companies are benefiting from that in a massive way. So it's I think interesting to see where that piece is going to land. But furthermore, it's the talent base is just as they go out, they have this experience, they have this knowledge, you get drilled into you, like seeing things from a different angle, seeing different ways to do things better. And then, with launch now, not necessarily becoming more of a commodity, but it's definitely moving in that direction. The prices have gone down exponentially. The launch cadence at SpaceX in particular has gone up tremendously. That opens up a whole new applications layer. So you're seeing a lot of these engineers move into, more in-space applications, satellite applications, but even, the broader tech ecosystem, there's a bigger emphasis now. It used to be, predominantly software. Now it's, hardware, robotics, manufacturing, AI. So, just the broader benefit to the ecosystem of this capability, didn't really, the industry was not trending in that direction before, some of these companies like SpaceX and Tesla came along.
Yeah, and sort of on the flip side of that, what we're seeing is the shakeup in the launch, community. And so we were tracking 125 launch companies globally that raised capital. There's way more than that sort of said they were going to do it. Only 6 have made it to orbit. So recently Virgin Orbit filed for bankruptcy on April 4th. The shakeup is already underway. And so, we're seeing hundreds of engineers that have got, that have operated in these, intense environments, executed under pressure, learn, some really important entrepreneurial lessons, and are going to work at other companies, whether it be upstream or downstream, or founding their new, companies themselves. And so, it is that sort of shakeup that I think is also, there's a positive story behind that. It's tough when, anybody loses a job, but that knowledge doesn't go away. It gets carried on to the next role and continues to build. So, I think with that, we're about at time. So I just want to sort of wrap it up by saying, we're seeing history repeat itself, as space proves once again that it can attract top talent. This new generation of space companies, they're demonstrating their ability to develop and mature capable leaders. And those leaders are going on to found new companies. Between the partners here at Space Capital and our networks, we're 1 degree separation from all of these founders. Our focus on space means that we're proactively building relationships with top business and engineering talent while they're still working at these companies. And we're using our platform Space Talent to then develop relationships and foster community amongst thousands of top talents early in their career. So our commitment to the long-term development of talent provides us a really unique advantage to source, win, and support the next generation of founders. And we couldn't be more excited about, the opportunity to work with them. So thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Justice. I appreciate it.